Free Speech Under Siege: The Deadly Price of Criticizing Islam. Written by Aditi Joshi. Throughout history, those who have criticized or questioned Islamic beliefs have often faced serious repercussions, including threats, violence, or even assassination. This ongoing suppression raises important concerns about free speech, personal safety, and the expanding influence of ideological extremism. Islam is often called a religion of peace, yet history shows a recurring pattern of violence as a primary response to perceived insults or dissent. From death threats to mob violence, the Islamic world has consistently shown intolerance toward opposing views. While modern societies have progressed toward greater liberalism and acceptance, reactions to criticism within Islam have remained essentially unchanged. This article examines this paradox's historical, ideological, and contemporary aspects. Historical roots of violence in Islamic doctrine. Islamic texts and traditions provide a foundation for violent responses to criticism and apostasy. The concept of jihad, often interpreted as armed struggle, is deeply embedded in Islamic teachings. The Quran contains numerous verses urging believers to fight against non-believers, Surah At-Tawbah 9:5. 1, and the Hadith reinforces the idea of punishing apostates with death, Sahih Bukhari 52:256. 2. The precedent for silencing dissent was established in the early days of Islam. Prophet Muhammad ordered the assassinations of several critics, including Qabi ibn al-Ashraf and Asma bint Marwan, setting a model for violent retribution. 3. 4. The rapid Islamic conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries further cemented the role of force in expanding and maintaining Islamic rule. This legacy has endured, with blasphemy and apostasy still carrying the death penalty in many Islamic countries. One of the most glaring manifestations of Islamic mob violence is extrajudicial killings in response to accusations of blasphemy or perceived insults. In nations like Pakistan, the mere suspicion of blasphemy can lead to brutal executions by angry crowds, bypassing legal frameworks entirely. For instance, Asia Bibi, a Pakistani Christian woman falsely accused of blasphemy, spent nearly a decade on death row before being acquitted. However, Islamist mobs demanded her execution, leading to nationwide riots and violent protests. 5. Also in Pakistan, Mishal Khan, a university student, was accused of blasphemy and lynched by his own classmates in 2017. Although later investigations confirmed his innocence, his killing was widely celebrated. 6. Similarly, in 2015, atheist blogger and writer Avijit Roy was brutally hacked to death in Dhaka, Bangladesh, for advocating secularism and challenging Islamic beliefs. His killers defended their actions as protecting Islam. 7. 8. Global patterns of retaliation. In the cases mentioned above and those that follow, one thing remains evident. Islam, as a reactionary religion, does not tolerate dissenting opinions. It enforces its dominance through fear, often resorting to violence, including brutal killings, to maintain its authority. Throughout history and into the present, no critic of the religion has escaped the harsh consequences of challenging its doctrines. Theo van Gogh murder, 1957-2004. Dutch filmmaker Theo van Gogh was a vocal critic of Islam's treatment of women. His film Submission, made in collaboration with Ayaan Hirsi Ali, depicted verses from the Quran projected onto a woman's body to highlight domestic violence and oppression. On November 2, 2004, Van Gogh was brutally murdered by Mohamed Bouhieri, a Dutch-Moroccan Islamist. Bouhieri shot Van Gogh multiple times, slit his throat, and pinned a note to his chest with a knife, warning of the consequences of criticizing Islam. 9. Charlie Hebdo Massacre, 2015. Charlie Hebdo, a French satirical magazine, was attacked on January 7, 2015, by Islamist terrorists Saeed and Sharif Kouachi, who killed 12 people, including key editorial staff. The attack was in retaliation for publishing caricatures of Prophet Muhammad, a long-standing target of the magazine's satire. The massacre sparked global debates on freedom of speech and religious intolerance, but threats against critics of Islam persisted. 10, 11, 12, 13. Samuel Paty beheading, 1973 to 2020. French schoolteacher Samuel Paty was targeted for teaching a lesson on free speech, during which he discussed the Charlie Hebdo cartoons of Muhammad. On October 16, 2020, an 18-year-old Chechen refugee beheaded Paty outside his school in Conflans-Saint-Honorine, France. The attacker had been incited by online Islamist campaigns that falsely accused Paty of blasphemy. His gruesome murder underscored the persistent dangers educators face when addressing topics related to Islam. 1415. Nupur Sharma forced into hiding, 2022. In 2022, Nupur Sharma, then a spokesperson for India's ruling BJP, made remarks about Islam and Prophet Muhammad during a televised debate. Her comments led to massive international outrage, diplomatic tensions, and violent protests. Multiple Islamist groups issued death threats against her, forcing her into hiding under police protection. Though she survived, her case highlights how even verbal critiques of Islam can provoke extreme and violent reactions. 16. Kanhaiya Lal murder, 1975 to 2022. Kanhaiya Lal, a Hindu tailor in Udaipur, Rajasthan, was brutally murdered on June 28, 2022, by two Islamists, Muhammad Riaz Attari and Ghaus Muhammad. His crime? Allegedly supporting Nupur Sharma's statements on social media. The attackers recorded themselves slitting his throat and later justified the killing as an act of revenge against blasphemy. The beheading sent shockwaves across India, highlighting the dangers faced by those who express views perceived as critical of Islam. 17. How Islamist groups silence dissent. While spontaneous mob attacks and lynchings reflect broader societal trends, organized Islamist groups escalate this violence to a systematic level, acting as state or non-state enforcers of religious dominance. Groups such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban implement collective punishment as a means of silencing critics, using brutal enforcement to maintain their authority. The Islamic State, ISIS, became notorious for its public executions, carrying out beheadings, stonings, and burnings against individuals accused of apostasy, blasphemy, or collaborating with Western forces. These executions were intentionally broadcast to instill fear and assert control. Similarly, in Afghanistan, the Taliban imposed severe penalties, including death, for actions perceived as disrespectful to Islam, reinforcing their rigid religious rule. Meanwhile, jihadist networks like Al-Qaeda have orchestrated targeted assassinations of individuals such as filmmaker Theo van Gogh and author Salman Rushdie for their critiques of Islam, with attacks either successfully carried out or attempted. These groups do not operate solely as terrorist organizations. They also represent extreme manifestations of the mob mentality that pervades certain Islamic societies, where violence serves both as a tool of punishment and a means of consolidating power. As the world moves toward greater openness and freedom, Islamic intolerance remains deeply rooted, continuing to uphold outdated restrictions on speech and belief. While secular democracies champion free expression and pluralism, many Islamic societies still enforce strict blasphemy laws, often with severe and violent consequences. In Europe, where laws protect criticism of all religions, Islamic groups frequently demand censorship and, in some cases, resort to violence when their beliefs are scrutinized. In the Middle East and South Asia, apostasy and blasphemy remain punishable by death in numerous countries, fostering a culture of fear and forced religious conformity. On a global scale, Islamic nations have repeatedly attempted to push for international blasphemy laws through United Nations resolutions, seeking to impose their religious taboos beyond their own borders. Islamic radicalism in the West. Despite enjoying the freedoms of the West, radical Muslims frequently respond with violence when Islamic beliefs are questioned or criticized. In Sweden, Quran burnings carried out under free speech protections have led to death threats and assassination attempts by Islamists, with Salwan Momika being one of the most notable cases. In the UK, fear of being labeled Islamophobic led authorities to overlook mass sexual exploitation cases involving predominantly Muslim perpetrators, highlighting how Islamic intolerance can suppress even law enforcement efforts. 18. Additionally, in several European countries like France and Sweden, the rise of Islamic enclaves, often referred to as no-go zones, has allowed religious groups to enforce their own de facto laws, challenging the authority of secular governance. Salwan Momika murder case. Radicalized segments of Muslim communities continue to demand that Western nations adopt Islamic restrictions, eroding the very liberties that allowed them to settle and thrive. One such case of the most recent brutality that has eroded the Western fabric is Salwan Momika, the man who famously burned the Quran and was shot dead while on a live stream. Born on June 23, 1986, in Karakash, Iraq, Momika was an ethnic Assyrian and Syriac Catholic who grew up amid sectarian violence. He was involved in politics and militia activities, initially serving as a security guard for the Assyrian Patriotic Party in Mosul. 19. After fleeing his hometown in 2012 following a fatal car accident that led to a prison sentence, he joined the Popular Mobilization Forces, PMF, in 2014, aligning with the Christian Spirit of God Jesus Son of Mary Battalion, under the Iran-backed Imam Ali Brigades. 20. He later founded the Syriac Democratic Union and the Falcons of the Syriac Forces, affiliated with the Babylon Brigade. Internal conflicts eventually forced him to leave Iraq in 2017. 21. After a brief stay in Germany, Momika sought asylum in Sweden in 2018 and was granted a temporary residence permit in 2021. He became one of Sweden's most polarizing figures due to his Quran-burning demonstrations, which, though controversial, were legally protected under the country's free speech laws. His repeated protests ignited global outrage, diplomatic tensions, and threats to his life. Despite the backlash, he insisted that religious sensitivities should not restrict freedom of expression. 22. On January 29, 2025, Momika was shot dead while live-streaming on TikTok from his home in Södertälje, Sweden, just hours before a court ruling on his Quran-burning protests. Swedish authorities arrested 5 suspects but later released them due to insufficient evidence. 23. 24. Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson suggested possible foreign involvement, raising questions about whether extremist groups, state actors, or ideological opponents orchestrated his assassination in response to his outspoken criticism of Islam. Regardless of one's opinion of Momika's actions, his assassination underscores a growing threat to free expression and highlights the dangers of challenging religious beliefs in an increasingly polarized world. His murder raises critical issues, including the double standards of free speech, where certain ideologies receive strong legal and social protections while others face violence for their critiques. It also brings into question the state's role in protecting dissent, as governments have a duty to safeguard individuals exercising their legal rights, even when their views are unpopular. Furthermore, it exposes the danger of silencing critics through violence. If such acts become an accepted response to controversial speech, the very foundation of free discourse is at risk. The unchanging nature of the beast. Despite the modern world's progress toward inclusivity and free discourse, Islam continues to enforce suppression, intimidation, and violence as core mechanisms of control. Even in free societies, criticism of Islam is often stifled due to the threat of violent repercussions, creating a chilling effect on speech. In countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan, state-sanctioned intolerance persists, with apostasy still punishable by death, demonstrating that institutionalized brutality remains deeply embedded in governance. Whether through mob violence, terrorist attacks, or oppressive state policies, Islam has consistently justified violent responses to dissent, reinforcing its ideological rigidity despite the pressures of modern reform. While other religions have undergone reformation and adapted to modern values, Islam has largely resisted such change, clinging to an ideology where dissent is met with violence rather than debate. Despite the world's progress toward greater acceptance and pluralism, Islamic responses to criticism and perceived insults remain largely unchanged. Violence, death threats, and mob retribution continue to be the first line of defense against dissent. If the global community is to uphold the values of free expression, it must confront this paradox and demand accountability from those who seek to silence criticism through fear and force.